Mr. Murli, Mr. Ramswamy, Mr. Arloli, respected seniors and other friends. In fact, Murli gave two secrets. One, he said, I voted for him. Incidentally, let me tell you, it's a secret ballot. I wouldn't know how he knew it, but I'm not going to question his wisdom at it. And the second thing is, I can see at least 300, 400 people here. And I'm sure every one of us will admit that we are not able to keep our spouses happy. Now, here is one gentleman who has understood how to keep 401 spouses happy, including himself. I'm always amazed with his great abilities to, understand how to make my spouse happy. Keeping my spouse happy for me itself is impossible. I don't know how he manages it at his home as well as tries to manage it at my home. It's something astounding. Incidentally, before I get started with the subject, I also had the privilege of listening to Selva Ganesh a little while back. Well, I cannot agree less with what Mr. Selva Ganesh said in terms of how taxes are evaded and how there are so many situations. In fact, almost everybody here would be aware that we do stand up for cases in the Tribunal and Settlement Commission and whatnot, and before the commissioners and whatnot. And there are circumstances where I personally know that the SSC has evaded the taxes. But then it's my profession to just defend the SSC, and therefore I defend it. In fact, there was one case, let me share this. When SC came to me after a search and all that, and when the assessments were completed and when the appeal was there, he came to me and I said, see, these are all 68 additions. You need to prove genuineness, you need to prove creditworthiness, and you need to prove that these transactions are all in order. Whatever are the tests? Now I asked him, I would like to have evidences to show this. Now the first thing he starts, he says, I have the PAN number, I have this, I have return copy, I have this, I have that, what not. And when he is taking out the papers, he is showing me the original bank statement of the other person. And along with that comes the checkbook of the other man, duly signed. Duly signed by him. That means what? It's as simple as this, that this fellow is running that account for all practical purposes. This is one side of story. In fact, when he told me, I said, don't give all this, you give me only photocopy, I'll be happy. I don't want to see all this. So, when we practice also, sometimes we face difficulties. In fact, one of the first lessons that I learned when I started my appellate practice was that you should not utter falsehood. And the second lesson that I learned was that does not mean that you must speak the truth. You can keep quiet. That's perfectly acceptable. So, if somebody asks me, do you have the original bank statement? I will just keep quiet. I will say, Assassi. Well, this can go on. But at the same time, I do have a bit of a reservation on one aspect. While there are people who are evaders, I will not possibly be able to fully agree that there is in this country a tendency to evade in general. I am not able to fully agree with that. It is there everywhere. It is a human mind to do what you are told not to do. This starts from childhood. You go and tell your young son or daughter, don't do this, and you can be sure. So this is a human tendency. This is not an Indian tendency. Let's not look at it as an Indian tendency, because I think we are downgrading ourselves, and I think we need to be proud that we are otherwise Indians. One. And two is, there has been definitely a tendency on the part of people in this part of the world to be large-scale evaders, without a doubt. And he knows better about how these havalas operate and these 10 rupee notes operate and what not. Today 10 rupee notes are not used. If you want to know, all I need is your phone number for your identity. So if Mr. Ramsamy is coming to me, I am a havala dealer, all I get is his phone number. When he comes, he just dials a missed call and I see the number and I know it is him.
My information is slightly outdated.
So things have gone far. Technology
That was from a search that happened in 1998. That was an illustrative example.
Technology has grown quite a bit, and even the 10 rupee trail is not left now. So, just like what you were saying. But at the same time, I am not quoting from what I know. If you will all recall, there used to be these budget speeches of Sri Palkiwala immediately after the budget, where he used to come under address under the auspices of the SIRC of ICAI. And he used to make a statement every time. I used to attend these as a student of chartered accountancy. I do not know whether all of you will agree with me, but if you do, I'll be, to an extent, be able to appreciate, or we will be able to appreciate why it was said. He used to always say talk about various amendments, and all of you, I'm sure, will know that he was a impossible speaker. He used to reel out figures and numbers and what not, and invariably you would not know whether he's speaking the right numbers also, because we don't know. But the fact was that he was so knowledgeable and at a level where none of us could even imagine. And he used to say every time that tax laws in this country are made on the foregone premise that every Indian is a crook. If we agree with this, then we understand again what is the next problem. The next problem is, see, for example, when there are artificial disallowances, your real income is not taxed.
Can I also add one more thing to that? The second premise is that every officer is also a crook. That's what.
No, but then the officer also happens to be an Indian taxpayer. See, again, now just before we get to the brass tacks, as Sir was saying, it's very important to understand that taxation are technically tax laws. When there are two litigants, one is the government and one is us, we are not adversarial in the first place. In fact, very often people wonder how I am able to share an excellent rapport with almost every departmental representative. But what they don't understand is I am fighting for some assessee. It is not my case. That gentleman is getting a salary and fighting for the government of India. He is supposed to do that, I am supposed to do this. After it is over, what is wrong if both of us sit together over lunch? In fact, I will just recollect one instance where one of their so-called very fiery DRs, anybody would understand who it is. He is not a DR now, and I guess anybody would have got the name by now, if you know how the tribunal works. Both of us were arguing at such decibel levels that somewhere the bench said, Mr. Bhanushekar and Mr. So-and-so, please do not fight among yourselves. Both of us knew we were not fighting each other. The bench was not aware. And they said, anyway, it's now 1:20, so what we will do is we will break for lunch and we will continue post-lunch. The first thing that both of us did after it was over, walked down the corridor saying, what are you doing for lunch? He said, I don't have lunch. I said, I also don't have lunch. He said, we'll go together. Both of us went together, shared the lunch, came back and continued the fight. What is our problem? Taxes of the department are, if it is not collected, he is not bothered. If my assessee pays or does not pay the tax, I have already collected my fees, I am not bothered. Who is bothered about it? We are not bothered about the outcome. We are just standing up to argue. So to that extent, I would think that all these powers that he is talking of are probably to be legitimately be there. We cannot say search or survey should go, or someone should go, 131 should go. But then at the same time, we would argue so many things. See, I for one believe that I don't have to agree with what I am arguing. I am only here to convince somebody, not myself. In more often than not, if you ask me personally, I would not be convinced only. Because the kind of information that we have would be very, disturb our mind. But then we are very clear in our mind that we are not doing anything wrong. If a doctor saves a criminal, he does his job. After that, if the criminal goes and shoots 40 people, he can't do a damn about it. My fellow will continue to go and evade. I am not at all bothered about it. Next time he comes to me, I will still defend him. I will not teach him how to evade. I will teach him to plan, I will teach him all the rest of it, but I will probably even coach him to avoid but not evade. That is where the very thin line is drawn. Now coming back to the subject in hand, the subject in hand is an
Reminds me
issue
of
which is
professional
vexed.
ethics of Shivaji.
Sorry?
Professional ethics as stated in the movie Shivaji.
Incidentally, there is a very beautiful book called Advocates, which is authored by one David Panik. This was gifted to me by a very senior chartered accountant when I started my litigation practice. And the book has 3 rules for accepting a litigation work. The book is slightly on the lighter vein, and the 3 rules are: rule number one is that you must have the knowledge of the subject before you accept a brief. Second, you must have the time to spare before you can accept a brief. 3, you must be sure that the client will pay the fees before you accept a brief. Barring that, there is nothing that I can do. See, we are not here at the end of the day to help somebody evade. But if an evader comes to me, who will come to me? If I am a criminal lawyer, if I will not accept criminals, whom will I accept? What do I do then? I have to accept only a criminal as my client. The same way, it is possible that I may be defending an evader, but I don't encourage evasion. They are 2 different things. One is on a personal note, one is on my official work when I sit in a chair and work. Now coming back, the vexed issue of taxation of shares and securities, that is capital gain or business income. In fact, the law would do good before I get started. The lawmakers will do well to have a deeming fiction here also. In fact, that may solve most of the problems. My friend here was talking about having deeming fiction after deeming fiction after deeming fiction. And, sometimes we are not able to fathom why a deeming fiction is there. For example, if we were to take 43.5, it just deems that if there is no delivery, it is speculation. If there is delivery, there is no speculation. Simple. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule. But keeping that aside, it's deeming. You may have intended to speculate, but you took delivery, therefore it is not speculation. There is another person who did not intend to speculate, but did not take delivery, therefore it automatically becomes speculation. It could go on. But that deeming fiction could probably be inserted to say what is business, what is capital gain. I think it will make life a lot easier. But keeping that on one side. As Mr. Murli was pointing out, this is a real vexed issue. And in fact, this has almost literally become like, if I say it is business, department says it is capital gain, and if I say it is capital gain, department says it is business. Now, let's look at it differently. When do I say it is business? I say it is business when I have a long-term capital loss, which will get ignored because long-term capital gain is exempt. Which will get ignored because long-term capital gain is exempt from taxation. Therefore, I want it to be business income, so that I will have that loss to set off against some other income. On the contrary, when I have profits and when I want the exemption or the benefit of the lower rate of taxes, I try to say that it is capital gain, while the department tries to say no, it is business. This is just like our 10A, 10B. Until today, I am sure, nobody has been able to fathom whether 10A, 10B is a deduction or an exemption. For simple reason that I may myself been party to arguing before. In fact, the first of the decisions that came from the tribunal in the whole of the country was a case that I argued, where I successfully argued that it was a deduction. Couple of months later, I was standing up and arguing this is an exemption. The bench asked me, you only argued like that. I said, I was paid that day to say this, today I am paid for this, what am I to do? Same thing. We also invariably, when we are filing the returns, we are not sure. Now, the pity is, whenever I say it is a reduction, department says it is an exemption. Whenever a department says it is an exemption, I say it is a reduction. It's actually the vice versa. Neither of us are consistent. In fact, the only consistency is that the other man is wrong. Barring that, there is no consistency in this. Now, the same problem happens even in respect of business income. In fact, Mr. Murli was also referring to circulars. In fact, there is one instruction of 1989 which is instruction number 1827, and again a circular dated 15th June 2007, which virtually rule the field insofar as departmental instructions and circulars are concerned. Interestingly, if you go to the circular of 2007, the board would have placed very great reliance on an advance ruling in a case called in a case called Fidelity North Star Fund, where after detailed analysis, the authority for advance ruling held that the income that was rising was in the nature of capital gains to the fund and not in the nature of business. Now, most of us would have thought that this went in favor of assessee. No, this went against the assessee. The reason being that this was an offshore fund and their claim that it was business income was on the simple premise that it will be exempt in India if it is not, if it is treated as business, because only the other nation has a right to tax it. On the contrary, if it is held as capital gain, India has a right to tax it. This is exactly what they want. Now they lost the case. And it was held to be capital gain. Most of us would have imagined that the assessee won. No. Now the board also relies on this. Now the board has, through these two circulars, I don't want to, or instruction and circular, laid out certain ground rules to decide as to what is to be treated as capital gain when it is to be treated as business. Now to very quickly run through some of these items, it says, one, is the purchase and sale is normal trade or is it just an allied activity or an incidental activity? Could be one test. Two, was his intention to earn profit or was his intention to wait for it to appreciate or earn dividend? The second test. What is the scale of activity? Whether it is done continuously and regularly, whether it is done out of own funds or borrowed funds, whether if it is a company, the memorandum articles permit such trading, what is the typical holding period, what is the ratio of sales to purchase, what is the time devoted, what is the extent of income derived from this compared to his total volume of income, and to what extent is his livelihood dependent on this kind of income, the share income, what is the characterization in the books, whether the securities are listed or unlisted, whether they are in sister concerns, investment or otherwise, whether they are transactions made by promoters, what is the number of, not the number of transactions, the number of stocks dealt in, whether the monies are paid and received or whether they are book entries. Now the first instruction gave all these tests and said that if these tests are looked into, you will be able to decide whether it is business or capital gain. And at the end of it, a caveat. See, nothing comes without a caveat. In fact, even Santa comes with a clause. Day before yesterday being Christmas, we will appreciate that even there is a rider. He comes with a clause only. Now coming back, these were the tests the board said, and at the end of it is where the confusion again starts. They said none of these tests should be taken independently. No single criterion can be taken. These are the broad tests. For example, when we were arguing one case, the department from the other side said, after all, he has borrowed money, therefore it is business. I said, to buy my house also I borrowed money. Is anyone here who has not borrowed money to buy a house? Unless you are extremely rich, I don't think it happens. Now, do we buy and sell houses as a business? The answer may be no. So, there cannot be any single test to decide whether a particular income is under the head capital gain or business, but these are the broad tests, is what the board said in its first instruction. Then came the circular of 2007, circular number 4 of 2007, trying to say that these are supplementary to the earlier instruction. So the earlier instruction is still there and supplementary. And they have drawn huge reference from certain decided cases, a couple of decisions of the Supreme Court, and also from the authority for advance ruling that I was talking about. Now, one decision of Supreme Court where the Supreme Court said that whether a particular transaction is in the nature of business or in the nature of investment is well within the knowledge of the assessee. And it is the assessee who has to produce proof or evidence to demonstrate that he intended to hold it as investment or as stock and trade. because he is the person who knows best. Nobody can know better than me as to what I was intending to do. And as I mentioned a little earlier, the decision of the authority for advance ruling, where they said magnitude of transactions, again the same test, more or less, magnitude of transactions, the memorandum of association permitting, the motive to earn profit, etc., etc., etc. Now, it was through this board circular again where some clarity was lent to at least one aspect. They said assessees can maintain two portfolios, one for business and one for investment. There is nothing wrong. It is not that if you are dealing in shares, you cannot have a portfolio of investment. You can have a portfolio of investment, you can have a portfolio of business as well, that is stock and trade as well. You can hold two portfolios, was the clarity that was given through this circular. But again, once again, they reiterated saying no single principle can be considered decisive. The officers have to look at each and every of these tests that we have already said and ultimately come to the conclusion whether a particular transaction is in the nature of business or otherwise. I go to the theory on this, and thereafter we could probably look at some practical aspects. Incidentally, there is also this decision of the Supreme Court in a case called Venkataswamy Naidu, where the issue was not regarding shares though, but was regarding land. In fact, in my opinion, more often than not, there should be hardly a dispute on land, but dispute on land, whether it is capital asset or stock and trade, is not an issue today or yesterday. This was a case that was decided in 1959, even before the 1961 Act came into force. That means it was under the 1922 Act. Right? That means this has been fought even from my great-grandfather's days. Right? Because my grandfather, I know, was born in 1902, which means he would have been hardly 20 years when the 1922 Act came. Even my great-grandfathers have been fighting all this, leave alone the fact that we are fighting today. Today volumes have become big, the amounts have become large. As Mr. Selvaganesh was also pointing out, 100 crores has become a norm. Earlier, when even 2 crores or 3 crores was considered big. So numbers are also multiplying. For example, if you take land today, somebody claims that it is agricultural land which he has transferred, and if you see the price for which he has transferred it, he will say 42 crores. That's because the city is also growing. Towns are growing. And there are builders who are ready to pay that kind of price for a so-called agricultural land. Now, these are vexed issues, but then coming back to the tests laid down by the Supreme Court in Venkataswamy Naidu's case, it is pretty interesting. First, they say, whether a person is invested in the land to hold it for some time and to enjoy the income, or whether he has done it with a view to resell it, is the first aspect that you need to look at. Again, these are all very subjective. The second is, they say, whether the purchase and sale is incidental to business or whether it is just ancillary to a person's business. 3, the nature of the commodity. Of course, they were dealing with land, but they went further and laid down some tests and said, nature of the commodity and quantity that was purchased and sold. The next, did the buyer make any changes to the asset so as to make it easily resaleable? The next is whether it is associated, what were the incidental activities that were associated. For example, let's say I bought a piece of land or I bought some shares, I intended to hold it, but suddenly my daughter's marriage is fixed. Now I want to sell off these shares, or suddenly the price escalates. I want to sell it and make it liquid. That's possibly could be the reason. Or Mr. Selvaganesh could have conducted a search and seized my jewelry. Now he says, if you substitute cash, I will give you the jewelry. My wife is nagging me, let's say. What do I do? My wife is not concerned about the shares anyway. She is concerned about the jewelry, let's say. I'm assuming, I don't have the audacity to say more than this. Or we will say, your wife. Why my wife? Your wife is nagging you. What do? You probably sell the shares and give the cash to the department and say, give me back the jewelry. There could be any attendant circumstances. Then they talk about whether there are similar transactions, whether they are repetitive, whether there have been transactions which are voluminous, whether he intended to resell, etc. But then interestingly, they also lay down one more theory. And they have taken an example there. They said, let's assume that somebody bought a piece of a work of art. And let's assume that after a period of holding, he has sold it, maybe a short period or a long period. Should we immediately conclude that it is business? They say no. He could, in the interregnum, have wanted just the pride of possession. For that purpose, he could have bought it, in which case it can still be regarded as an investment because he is not intending to resell. Now let's keep all these tests on one side. While we keep all these tests on one side, I think in reality and in practice, the simple question that I will ask myself or any assessee who comes to me is, what is the period for which you held it? My first and foremost question, apart from everything. Now, normally, I am not talking about an investor for a minute. A businessman is very unlikely to hold a particular share or shares for an extended period of time. No businessman will normally hold his stock and trade for a very extended period of time unless he is forced to. For example, there could have been a substantial fall in the price of the shares, therefore he may have chosen to hold it. But even in a case where there is a substantial fall in the prices, if he has chosen to hold it, and if he claims that he is an investor, I think the department can do mighty little to disprove it. So long as other things are, the other parameters are met. This would be something which I would think of, because the period of holding gives me a very clear indication. See, let's forget a person who is dealing in shares. Take anybody, a normal businessman. If somebody buys, say, he is dealing in, say, watches. He buys the watch and sells the watch. Let's say he's a trader. You think he will hold the watch for 5 years, saying 5 years later the price will go up? No. Today, if you see these HMT watches, winding watches values have gone up. Did HMT hold it saying it will go up? In fact, HMT was on the verge of closing down. And suddenly there is a hope that these winding watches are picking up, so they are not trying to close down their watches division now. Nobody holds, a businessman does not hold shares or assets or his stock and trade merely because prices have fallen, because a businessman does not think merely in terms of profit. Every businessman will think of cash flow. We are accountants ourselves, and we know that cash flow is more crucial to a businessman than business is, than profit is. Reason being that unless he is able to divest himself of this so-called bad script and buy some good scripts which he can make profit on, he is only going to be stuck with money, because he is also going to have, as again the earlier speaker was speaking, he wants the money in hand. That is it. See, for example, he was talking about people paying taxes as late as possible. Why? Because he wants cash flow in hand. If we accept this to be real, then I think this could be the singularly largest test that we could look at as necessary to determine that a particular transaction is in the nature of business or in the nature of a capitalist or investment, I will say. Or the distinction between shares being held as stock and trade and investment. Now, having said this, is this a singular test? Maybe no. For example, whether it is borrowed funds, whether it is own funds, all of these can be relevant and will be relevant, for sure. But that does not end the game. See, if at some point, let us also understand, if there is extraordinary clarity in the law, what do we all do? How does Mr. Murli conduct these seminars, let us say? Today, because of the confusion in the minds of the assessee, and because of his belief that we have understood, we are still surviving. Barring that, there is no reason. It's only a belief in his mind. And that I call a presumption. Actually, why I call a presumption is because presumptions are true unless rebutted. Whereas in my personal knowledge, I know it is a belief, real. That, see, in fact, there are so many chartered accountants here sitting to learn income tax. Is there any assessee who has come? Fellow is clear. He does not have a doubt at all. The doubt comes only when he enters my office. Oh, it could be business, it could be capital gain. Until that time, that fellow would have happily been living. And we are, it's but natural that assessees also would like to liquidate the share, particularly in a case where he is intending to trade. Now, for example, I have got some scripts myself, let us say, and I have just been holding it for a long time. I have not even sold it for quite some time. I may have sold some other shares, but some shares I might be holding. What is wrong in coming to the conclusion that it is business or investment on the basis of the period of holding? Period of holding could be a singularly largest indicator in my view. Of course, frequency of transactions, all of these may be relevant. Interestingly, as I said, the 2007 circular came up with one very great clarity to say that you can hold two portfolios. Now, larger questions will arise. Should I necessarily have two demat accounts? My view is no. What the board is talking of as two portfolios is only two portfolios in your understanding, in your accounts, say. So the first aspect, if I were advising an assessee, the first thing I would tell an assessee is maintain your books of account and maintain a clear demarcation between investment and stock and trade. Make it very clear. Now the second aspect, which could be very, very crucial and where we as accountants can probably guide an assessee properly, is wherever he is showing it as investment, we show it at the acquisition cost. Wherever he is showing it as stock and trade, assuming some portion of it is stock and trade, we are definitely going to value it at cost or net realizable value, whichever is lower. For sure, the net realizable value in many cases may be much more, and therefore we may be valuing it at cost also. A table to show along with the accounts that this is the cost, this is the net realizable value, this is how I have valued, will probably be a good indicator to show that the assessee clearly intended to hold it as stock and trade, because he has been valuing it consistently at that price. And the department would not have taken objection to the aspect that, they were treated as stock and trade, and in some cases it was valued at slightly lower than cost, which all department accepted in assessment. Having accepted that in assessment in earlier years, it may not be open for them to suddenly wake up and say, no, this is today not your business, or these are also your business assets, etc. All those were valued at cost and you did not raise an objection. Here I valued it at cost or net realizable value and you have not raised an objection. That means that this is my investment portfolio, this is my stock and trade portfolio. Could be one of the ways by which we could, at the time of preparation of accounts, assist somebody in trying to create the demarcation and also leave what we call some kind of evidence to show that this is how we have been doing it. Now, while these decisions have been there, these circulars have been there, these instructions have been there, the earliest of the decisions that came from the tribunal and which got affirmed by the High Court on whether it is to be treated as business or capital gain, because largely this issue started post the exemption for long-term capital gain and the lower rate of tax for short-term capital gain vis-a-vis the higher rate of tax if it is held to be business. Now, the decision of the Mumbai Tribunal, which got affirmed by the Bombay High Court in a case called Gopal Purohit, was one of the early decisions on the subject, where they very clearly said two separate portfolios can be maintained. These are all delivery-based transactions and we have no reason to interfere with the decision of the tribunal on this subject. Now, one other aspect where we could probably exercise greater caution to show that it is held as investment or stock and trade, accounting-wise, purely from an accountant's perspective. See, if I hold an asset as my say stock and trade, then I will claim the expenditure on acquisition, etc., as part of my business expenditure. Or in other words, I will debit my P&L account. On the contrary, if I have purchased the shares and if my purchase is to be treated as investment, I am not permitted to debit my P&L account. On the contrary, I am permitted to add it to the cost of the asset. So, while accounting itself, what would prevent us from adding it to the cost of the asset where it is intended to be held as investment and claiming whatever is business as business alone, so that tomorrow this dispute does not arise? See, particularly where there are two portfolios is where greatest difficulty can arise. If there is one portfolio, at least it may be easier. But even where there is one portfolio, if we can maintain this clear demarcation by having a balance sheet and adding it to cost, maybe that will be a very good indicator, because if the department were to treat this as business, they ought to have allowed the business expenditure in the earlier year. Now let's take a simple case. I bought shares, I paid brokerage. I have added the brokerage to the cost of the share. Now 5 years or 1 year later or 6 months later or 12 months later, I am selling this share and department says that this is business. If it was business in the earlier year, they ought to have allowed the brokerage as an expense, which they did not. And if they did not do that, they suddenly cannot wake up and say that this is business in the current year. It has to continue as investment unless a different intention emanates from the attitude of the assessee. So, two aspects where I think as accountants we can assist an assessee is: one, adding it to cost or debiting P&L accordingly, and two is the valuation of stock, if it is held as stock and trade, to clearly show how it was valued, scrip wise, so that we will be able to establish that we have been following this principle very consistently. And for sure, at least one scrip would have dipped below the price at which we acquired. Nobody can buy at the lowest and sell at the highest. It doesn't happen in reality. It can happen to Warren Buffett, probably, not to us. He for him, whatever he touches become gold, maybe. That's what he is destined to when he was born. Therefore, we can look at these kinds of, safeguards to ensure that assessees don't get into unwarranted problems. Problems will continue, and if problems all stop, what do we do? In fact, there used to be one very senior chartered accountant who used to tell us earlier when I started my practice that one officer used to have a board on his table, just like this board, a similar board on the table, where it will read, it will face